Hi folks, HR Funk here. Back out on the range today with a brand new Law Enforcement Qualification Course Challenge video. Now if you've been watching this series, you already know what I'm attempting to do is to fire a law enforcement firearms qualification course from each of the 50 states for the purpose of comparing and contrasting those courses and ultimately determining what I think is the best law enforcement firearms qualification course in the country. Now in this series, I am concentrating on duty handguns. At some point in the future, I might do a similar series on off-duty and backup handguns, shotguns, rifles, etc. But right now, I'm concentrating on the duty handguns. As always, if you have access to your state's law enforcement firearms qualification courses, and you can get me copies of those courses, please let me know in the comment section of this video. If I don't yet have a course from your state, I will let you know where you can send that course to. And as always, if you can get me a target or two, that's very much appreciated. If you happen to be from one of those states that does not have a statewide mandated law enforcement firearms qualification course, but you can get me a course from a local agency, I'll use that local course as a representative of your state. Today's course is number 19 in this series, and it comes to us from the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts uses a 50-round course of fire to qualify law enforcement officers with their duty handgun, and the course takes place at distances of 15 yards, 10 yards, 7 yards, 5 yards, and 3 yards or less from the target. Massachusetts also uses the FBI Q target, although a slightly different variation that I have on the target board back here, but for all intents and purposes, this is the same target and it will work well for our purposes today. Now, like we've seen here recently with some other courses, Massachusetts uses a multi-tiered scoring system in their course, which requires the shooters to achieve both a certain minimum score on various stages, and I'll let you know what those minimum scores are when I do the lead-in for those stages. And also there is an 80% overall qualification score for the course. So when I plug this into my evaluation protocol, that makes it a little bit difficult, although I think what I'm going to do for Massachusetts is use just that overall 80% standard for this course. For today's challenger, I knew I wanted to use a Smith & Wesson pistol since they originate in Springfield, Massachusetts, but I had a hard time trying to figure out which one to use. Then I decided I'm just going to use the pistol that I carry every day. This is my Smith & Wesson M&P 40L. Now I am breaking a little bit from my pattern here, which is where I've been trying to use historical firearms or historical handguns for these videos. There's really not much very historical about this particular pistol, other than it is a first generation M&P, it's not a 2.0. Some of you may recall this pistol from earlier in the year when I did an evaluation video on the pistol itself, and then I also did a couple of videos where I talked about transitioning to the loopholed micro red dot optic, which is attached to the top of the pistol. Now I've got to say a couple of things about this optic, and this is the Leupold Delta Point Pro. When I was researching this optic, I saw references from some folks out there talking about the life of the battery in the Delta Point Pro being not all that great, especially compared to the Trijicon micro red dots. And I have found this battery to have extremely long life. In fact, this is the same battery that I've had since the beginning in this optic, and I installed this all the way back in February, I believe. And so far, it's still the same battery. And I keep a spare battery in my uniform pocket, just waiting for that reticle to start flashing, indicating the battery is getting low so I can swap it out. And again, so far this battery is going strong. Now, the Delta Point Pro does have that auto shutoff function where when the sight does not sense any kind of movement for 5 minutes or longer, it powers itself down, but then as soon as the sight moves or it senses movement, it immediately comes back on. And I think that goes a long way toward preserving the battery in this sight. But here again, this has been in there now for 7 or 8 months, and with all the moving around I do at work and as much motion as this sight senses, it still has not depleted that original battery. So again, I just throw that in there for anyone that has battery concerns about the Delta Point Pro. So far, I have not seen any reason whatsoever to be concerned. And here we go, folks. The Massachusetts Handgun Qualification course starts out at a distance of 15 yards from the target. From this distance, the shooter begins with 5 rounds loaded in the pistol and 5 rounds loaded into a second magazine. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to draw and fire out the first 5 rounds. After the 5th round, the slide will lock open on an empty chamber. The shooter then performs a reload, and during the reload, the shooter has to communicate with a second officer who is providing cover. and there is a very scripted dialogue that takes place between the shooting officer and the covering officer. When the shooting officer fires that last round and begins to reload, he has to shout to the other officer and say, "Cover." The second officer then responds by saying "covering," and then presumably provides lethal force cover on the threat while the first officer is performing the reload. Once the pistol is reloaded and the shooter is ready to continue, the shooter yells back to the covering officer, "Ready," and the covering officer responds by saying, "Okay." After that, the firing officer again fires out 5 more rounds into the target. This entire exercise has a time limit of 45 seconds. So let's see how it goes. And one thing I forgot to mention is at the end of this stage, the shooter has to have 4 of the 10 rounds inside of that proper scoring area of the target. Cover! Covering! Ready! Okay! And I didn't wait for all 45 seconds to run out and the timer to beep, but I completed that last exercise in 16.86 seconds, and all 10 shots are in the proper scoring area of the target. The next stage of this Massachusetts course of fire begins at 15 yards, but the firing actually takes place at 10 yards. And I think the easiest thing for me to do is just read you what the course description has written. Shooters begin on the 15-yard line, facing as indicated, with the weapon holstered. On command, gun, knife, or threat, shooters will pivot as indicated toward the threat, draw to a ready position, and challenge the target verbally. On command advance, shooters will advance to the 10-yard line, continuing to issue verbal commands. At the 10-yard line, the command to fire will be given. The shooter will engage with the stated number of rounds in the noted time limits. Now, when I go down to the next part of this description, it explains what the time limits are, what the rounds are to be fired, and how the shooter is to move. For the first phase of this stage, the shooter starts out facing to the left, and on the signal threat, the shooter pivots to the right and challenges the target. When the shooter arrives at the 10-yard line, the shooter then fires 2 shots into the body of the target in a time limit of 4 seconds. Time then stops, the shooter goes back to the 15-yard line. The second time through, the shooter is facing to his left. Actually, I turned to my left the last time. On the first one, the shooter is facing to the right. Second time, shooter is facing to the left. This time, on the command threat, the shooter turns, challenges the target, and then on the command to advance, moves up to the 10-yard line. Upon arrival there, when the instruction to fire is given, the shooter has to fire 3 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 5 seconds. Time then stops, and the shooter goes back to the 15-yard line. The final time through on this exercise, the shooter is facing 180 degrees away from the target. On the instruction threat, the shooter turns around, challenges the target. On the command advance, the shooter moves up to the 10-yard line, and there, when the signal to fire is given, the shooter has 7 seconds to fire 5 rounds into the body of the target. So what I'm going to do to try to simplify this a little bit is I'll start out facing the proper directions. I'll give myself the proper command, as you'll see here in the video, and then when I move up to the position of cover, I'm going to push the button on my timer. It will randomly give me a signal to fire, and I will fire out my rounds from that distance in the prescribed number of seconds according to the course description. And when I complete this stage, or I should say when a shooter completes this stage, 8 of the 10 rounds fired during all 3 phases of this have to be in the proper scoring area of the target, giving this phase, or this stage rather, a qualification score of 80%. Threat! Police officer, put the weapon down! Put it down! Drop it! Put the weapon down! Advance! Drop the weapon! Drop it or I'll shoot! Put the weapon down! Put it down! Threat! Police officer, drop the weapon. Drop it. Put it down. Put the weapon down. Advance. Drop the weapon. Put it down. Drop it. Threat. Police officer, put the weapon down. Police, drop the weapon. Drop the weapon. Put it down or I'll shoot. Advance. Drop the weapon. Put it down. Drop it. Do it now. Drop the weapon. And as you might have noticed, I got a little bit confused on that last phase. For some reason, when I fired my first 2 shots, I was thinking that was just a 2-shot phase. Then it occurred to me, wait, this is a 5-shot phase. So I fired out my last 3 shots, all of which were fired in a time span of 4.66 seconds. So they were all still off well under that 7-second time limit. So on we go to the 7-yard stage. At 7 yards, there are 2 different phases that are fired. The first one, again, begins at the 15-yard line, and on the command threat, the shooter has to draw and again issue verbal challenges to the target, as I was doing just a moment ago in that last stage. On the command advance, the shooter begins advancing to the 7-yard line. As the shooter is moving, there is a command threat that is given. When that's given, the shooter has to fire 2 rounds while moving. Now this is an important distinction. The shooter does not stop and fire those 2 rounds. Those rounds have to be fired as the shooter is continuing to move to a position of cover. Once the shooter arrives at cover, they take that position behind cover and the weapon goes to the low ready position. Then a second signal to fire is given, and from there the shooter has to fire 4 more rounds in a time limit of 5 seconds. So what I'm going to do as I'm advancing from the 15-yard line to the 7-yard line is again activate my timer. Whenever it beeps, I will fire out my 2 rounds as I'm moving. I'll then take my position of cover and I'll activate the timer again and fire out 4 more rounds in that time limit of 5 seconds. Threat! Advance! Police officer, put the weapon down! Drop your weapon! Put it down! The second phase of this Massachusetts course that takes place at a distance of 7 yards is ambidextrous or one-hand only shooting. In this phase, the shooter begins with the pistol in the dominant hand, and on the signal to fire, the shooter has to fire 2 rounds into the body of the target. Interestingly, there is no time limit in which those 2 rounds have to be fired. The shooter then transfers the pistol to the non-dominant hand, and on a second signal to fire, the shooter again fires 2 rounds into the body of the target. And again, there is no time limit for those 2 rounds. At the end of that phase, the shooter has to have 8 of the 10 rounds that were fired during both phases from the 7-yard line within the proper scoring area of the target, meaning from 7 yards, the qualification standard is 80%. And for the next stage, I'm up to a distance of 5 yards from the target. From here, I'm doing a forced transition drill. I have to start out with an intermediate response option already in my hand, and I guess what I'll use is my app, because I rarely use it for anything else. I'll start out with this in my shooting hand. On the signal to fire, I have to transition to my firearm, and I have to move a specific direction each time I perform this drill, and it's performed 4 different times. The first time through, on the signal to fire, I have to transition from my intermediate response option to my firearm, draw, move to my left, and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 4 seconds. The next time, I do the exact same thing, only this time I transition and step to the right and fire 2 rounds in 4 seconds. I reset and again step to the left, do the same thing, transition 2 rounds into the body in 4 seconds. And the last time through, I transition, step to the right, and this time I have to fire 4 rounds in a time limit of 6 seconds. And this stage has a qualification standard of 100%, meaning when I'm all done, all 10 of my rounds have to be in the proper scoring area of the target. I had to stop the video so I could reset my timer to 6 seconds. Final stage of the course, folks, and this takes place at a distance of 3 yards or closer. Basically, you have to be close enough to touch the target. This time on the signal to fire, the shooter has to use a defensive tactic as if to ward off an advancing hostile threat. So what happens is on the signal to fire, you have to strike the target and then move away from the target as you're accessing your firearm and engaging the target. This is done 5 different times, and each time you repeat the exercise, you have to do it slightly differently. The first time, you use your defensive tactic and you step to the right, and as you step to the right, you fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 3 seconds. And by the way, the 3 seconds goes from the signal to fire, so it includes the strike, the step, the draw, and your 2 shots. So the first time, signal to fire, step to the right, draw, fire 2 rounds into the target in a time limit of 3 seconds. The next time you do the same exact thing, only you step to the left. After that, the next time through, use your defensive tactic and you step back away from the target to create distance and fire your 2 rounds. After that, you step right and back, and the final time you step left and back. There is a danger associated with this particular stage, and the thing you have to be careful of if you are the shooter is to make sure that in the process of striking the target and drawing your firearm, you don't end up with your hand in front of the muzzle and actually put a bullet through your hand. So it's imperative to strike, bring that hand back the opposite side or to the opposite side of your body from the firearm as you are drawing that firearm to make sure it's not going to be in the path of any bullets. And the qualification standard for this stage is also 100%. So when I'm all done, all 10 of my shots have to be in the proper scoring area of the target. Folks, I had a technical difficulty on that last stage, and I'm not sure what happened. When I got to the 4th phase, where I was firing my shots while stepping back and to the right, somehow the camera turned itself off, and that didn't record. So when I figured out what had happened, I turned it back on and just reshot that stage and the stage where I stepped back and to the left. So when you saw those were actually reshoots. They weren't the first time through. And again, I don't know what happened to my camera. It seems to be working fine now. So apparently some kind of gremlins out here at the range are just messing with my equipment today. In any regard, the tail of the target after that last stage is a pretty messy one. As you can see, the target did not survive very well after that last 10 shots from such close range. But of the 50 shots that I fired during this Massachusetts handgun qualification course, 49 of them are in the proper scoring area of the target. There was one shot, and this was one of my shots that I fired with my non-dominant hand back at, I think that was 7 yards, and I managed to pull that one off, but all the rest are on there. So overall on the score, or overall on the course rather, I scored a 95%, and that meets the instructor's cut for Massachusetts, which is 94% or higher. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. That one shot was just my fault. I had it in my non-dominant hand, and normally I don't have a problem with that, but for some reason I jerked that first shot, and of course the shot went off the target. Now this course was, again, fairly easy to get confused. As you saw a couple of times on the way through there, I did get confused, and apparently maybe my equipment got confused too. I don't know. But there are some things that I find a little bit confusing, or maybe I should say baffling, about this course from a tactical standpoint. Beginning with that first phase where the shooter is back at 15 yards and fires out 5 rounds and then has to reload. If there is an officer covering that shooter, I'm not sure why the shooter doesn't take that opportunity to move to a position of cover, reload from behind cover, and then, if necessary, re-engage the target. It seems like tactically that would make more sense. Similarly, when we get to the next stage where I start out facing to the left, and then I'm facing to the right, and then I face away from the target, if there was a time limit associated with turning and engaging the target, I could see some sort of training benefit to that. But since there is none, you're simply turning around, recognizing the threat, and then starting to issue verbal challenges and all that type of thing. And then you get a command to advance, and it's not until you reach your ultimate destination you finally get the command to fire. Again, I'm just not sure what you accomplish by having the shooter start facing to the left, facing to the right, facing away, and all that. It doesn't seem to add anything to the training benefit of that particular stage. But those things aside, there was a lot involved in this course. There were a lot of critical skills that are tested on the part of the shooter. We did not have a true long-range stage. We started out at 15 yards, and everything was 15 yards and in. But there was shooting while moving, there was shooting from behind cover, there was dominant and non-dominant hand shooting, there was extreme close quarter shooting, there was forced transition training, all that type of thing going on. So I think the course is going to score pretty high. It just confuses me a little bit why some of the things are done the way they are done in this particular course. And let's hear it for our challenger today, folks. My M&P 40L performed flawlessly. I let it down for one shot with my non-dominant hand, but it worked perfectly for me. I can't blame anything, particularly that shot, on my pistol or on the Loophole Delta Point Pro. So my pistol performed very well, as I expected it would. This is the type of performance that I've come to expect from the Smith & Wesson M&P pistol. As I said at the beginning of the video, it's not a historical pistol by any stretch of the imagination, but it is the one I carry every day, and it does serve me very well. And that's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you purchase anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 5% off anything you buy from Optics Planet. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.